Chair adjudicate. Chair adjudicate for this round. With me adjudicating is.
Hi, I'm Beatrice. I will be your panelist today, pronounced she or they. And also, if my lovely chair would allow me to, I'd like to also be the timekeeper of this debate. So I will write down in the chat 1 if the first minute has elapsed, 7 if it's the 7th minute and you can no longer ask or receive POIs, and 8 if it's your last minute and you should wrap up. So other than that, very happy to be here and good luck.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being a timekeeper. That helps a lot. Uh, then two things just before you start your speeches, definitely point out the way that you would like points to be raised. Obviously, if you don't do that, your opponents will raise POIs and they might not be raised in the way you would prefer. So do point out that you may or may not disclose your preferred pronouns. That is on to you, and do not feel pressured, but feel welcomed. Um, Lastly, just be respectful both of protected times and of like just time limitations. Don't go past 8:15. Everything that you say at that time will unfortunately not be able to be part of the deliberation process. If there are no particular questions, I would like to invite Prime Minister to start this debate. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible if I speak like this?
Sure.
Okay. T-Polo T1, and I will be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Humans by nature will always seek comfort. It is who we are. From the acquisition of gadgets, like stoves to make cooking easier, to that of vacuums because we hate cleaning. Apps are just the next evolution. Now give us super apps. With that, we'll be pushing to you 3 arguments. Firstly, a practical on why we get better access to apps. Secondly, a practical on why we get better quality of super apps. And then thirdly, an argument in my second speaker speech as to why we're better for the progression. Cool. Two things to note, two things on setup before this. Firstly, what is our stance? One, we believe that the rise of super apps is better for the world and the progression of human interests. But secondly, what does this rise of super apps look like? 4 things. A, it looks like more competition because there's always profit motive. So companies will always exploit opportunities to capitalize on market share, i.e., Facebook works well, but someone invented Twitter and someone else invented Instagram. B, it looks like how the rise has been organic. That's because one, it is greatly as a result of market forces, i.e., individuals wanting more out of apps. And so ones like Facebook and TikTok adding multiple features such as Facebook Marketplace or apps like WebChat coming about in the first place. But secondly, it's because it's the next evolution of already effective technology, i.e. the diversification of the technology. It happens all the time. For example, in instances such as the car making industry, where we've added entertainment to cars in the form of screens, after making sure that the machine could effectively transport individuals. C, it looks like regulation is still
Why?
existing on our side. That's because things like antitrust laws and anti-monopoly laws still exist because there's still an incentive for like governments to ensure that this technology is accessible and to prevent market capture within the status quo. D, and finally, is there still an incentive for smaller apps to change their structures to remain competitive? That's because in-app development, to be able to compete with super apps, is the likely outcome for these specific apps. To invest more time into becoming a super app, because that's what individuals want within the status quo. It looks like companies adopting discounts because companies had already done that and had seized majority of the market. First argument then on why we're better for access to individuals. The claim of this argument is that super apps allow a greater amount of people to access apps. There's 2 big reasons here. Firstly, is because they're more user-friendly. That's for 2 reasons. A, because you only have to learn the functions of one specific app, i.e., how to navigate it and how it likely functions. But B, is because super apps are likely to allow people to engage with things like users interfaces that fit them well. It looks like being less complicated in the way that you function because you have to appeal to a broader combination of individuals. It looks like adopting multiple features and making them in the most common or simplistic ways because multiple individuals are likely to engage with this technology from all spaces. This is specifically good impacts for minorities who often tend to lack access to technology till later stages in life and have difficulty adapting to it. But secondly, it has greater impacts for the elderly who often have adaptability issues within the status quo and so are left behind by multiple apps and are left behind by technology. This is a unique benefit to our side, irrespective of whether or not individual apps can like boost the user interface, because irregardless of that, there's a centrality of apps that make it easier and commoner for individuals to engage with them. But secondly, is because often, if not always, the interfaces of these apps are not that identical. Are not that adaptable towards all circumstances and all individuals. The second big reason under this is because of economies of scale. There's two ways this is likely to manifest. Firstly, we're likely to get more research sharing between departments so that apps can be more efficient, i.e. those in banking apps or gaming apps, sharing specific mechanistic like work of how apps can be better in specific ways, shapes, or forms. But secondly, is because it lets individuals out like it lets individuals down prices because apps have to be more because of more concentrated technologists within the status quo, as opposed to startups that have high labor costs and are seeking to make a market profit and so have to make apps significantly more expensive so that they're able to keep up with the market and sustain themselves. This has two large impacts. Firstly, individual apps have to improve, meaning a greater ability to make things easier for individuals by attaching common things like apps to apps, for example, search bars to make it easier to navigate in app. But two, it makes people save time because everything is more convenient to them. The concentration of these apps means specifically that individuals have a broader base in terms of the way that they can likely engage with them. Comparatively, they're worse for three reasons. Firstly, is because there's no reward for innovation within the status quo. That's specifically because there's a stagnation within markets in the status quo, i.e. any marginal improvement is often quickly co-opted as a feature because it is ineffective. But secondly, is because any current development has been inefficient or insignificant in the way that it has come about in the status quo. Even marginal improvements don't have much bearing. But secondly, is because big companies allow subsidiary chains to seize market share to grow their profit by utilizing their names. For example, YouTube Music is unique to your side because you have multiple industries and multiple industries seeking to gain that market share. Thirdly, is because you have more sale of data on your side because it's all not concentrated. That's unique to you for two reasons. Firstly, is because people can concentrate political capital on our side to make it easier to hold individuals to account. But secondly, it means your harm is worse because data on your side is likely sold more than once to more than one actor. That means that the harm is specifically magnified because it is as if individuals are being violated multiple times. Before my second argument on why we're better for the quality of apps go.
Why is it the case that there's a meaningful learning barrier if you have different services anyways that necessitate different kinds of UI now? Why is this substantially different from just using different apps to begin with, who also have an incentive to make things as simple and convenient as possible?
That is the entire point. The diversification of apps means different UIs because of a need to stand out between specific apps. Even if that exists on our side, the reason why we're likely to have better UI and UI engagement is because individuals have to cater for more sophisticated apps within simpler ones. So, for example, communication technology is vastly simple. I mean, sending a text. But banking technology tends to cater towards individuals who are more centric and who engage with technology much more because of its specific features and the way that it comes about. In fact, explaining those types of technology is much more difficult to older individuals. Therefore, we believe that on our side, we can at least simplify this because they engage with more than one type of technology on our side. Secondly, on why super apps allow individuals better experiences. Three main reasons. Firstly, is because we have better competition on our side. That's for two main reasons. A is because super apps have to improve constantly in order to remain competitive. So there will always be like competition between super apps, but the only ability for them to gain market share is for them to constantly improve the way that they function. But secondly, is because there's access to economies of scale. That makes it easier for these apps specifically to develop in individualized ways, specifically because different apps have a different way of materializing their impacts. For example, communication apps can specifically focus on improving communications to a certain degree, and banking apps can do the same by like increasing the amount of technology that they have. The second reason is just access to economies of scale on their own. That's to say we have greater amount or greater ability to access individuals like technologists on our side or data coders on our side who are more likely to develop apps further because of an incentive to combine and gather apps in a manner that is efficient and effective for the most amount of individuals. It then becomes apparent that we're the side that is more accessible. I beg you to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech, and whenever leader of opposition is ready, I would like to invite them to answer proposition's claims. Thank you.
This debate was never about marginal improvements in interface design. Rather, we thought what mattered far more was the uncontrolled agglomeration of wealth that proposition allows. It was the mass exploitation of billions of users that concerned us, and it was only on opposition that we didn't allow these harms to run rampant under the guise of convenience, and on that basis, we are so proud to oppose. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, setup. Second, brief rebuttal. Lastly, 2 arguments. First argument on why you stifle competition and regulation. Second argument on privacy and data. Let's first talk about setup then. The first thing to note is that we would still support the existence of apps on our side that exclusively provide one service. So for instance, think Alipay or PayPal. And it's very unclear as to why apps that offer individual services can't access economies of scale the proposition illustrates. We thought PayPal very much could. But 2, I think it's important to emphasize just how massive super apps are and the trade-off in this debate. Perhaps individually cash transfer services or social media might be worth billions, but proposition is supporting a world that combines them into hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth agglomerated. And I think both teams need to accept, not at this moment, that there's a significant trade-off in this debate and the power and money that companies hold. Now let's move on to some brief rebuttal. I'm going to deal with their claim on accessibility. I think the response here is very simple. Even within apps that provide one service, companies probably have incentives to try and make it accessible, to expand their user base and make more money. And most companies do have the capacity to implement the illustrations that prop uses, like, quote, less complicated interfaces for elderly individuals in the first place. First argument then on stifling competition and regulation. Proposition cannot just assert in their setup that there is competition when the reality is super apps are so dominant that it's nearly impossible for organic competition to emerge. This is for several reasons. First, let's talk about enhanced network effects. The networking effect is exacerbated with super apps, and it basically refers to when your inclination to use an app depends on how many other people are also using it on the app. So for instance, think about social media. And while this obviously does exist to some extent with individual apps offering specialized services, super apps make the networking effect significantly more coercive for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it becomes all or nothing. You can't switch between PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo when everyone just generally uses WeChat for everything, and when you're still dependent on WeChat for other services. So there's more pressure to get and keep the app, even if you find some services despisable or not very useful because you're dependent on it for other things. But 2, there are many services that actually aren't dependent on the networking effect. So for instance, think about ride-sharing apps, where it doesn't truly matter whether or not my friend is also using Uber. But the problem is this changes in proposition's world. If ride-sharing apps are now attached to super apps, this means that you have less of an ability to leave the service or switch just because one particular service is bad. So you basically make all of these services that could operate independently and with competition dependent on the networking effect, and you turn it into monopolies. But 2, that you encourage cross-pollination in proposition's world. Because super apps include multiple other services, they have a significantly larger capacity. So think data, finances, and resources to use one service to artificially push others. So think about WeChat, where its cash transfer service is incompatible with other messaging platforms. Even though it's very possible to fix this, the problem is they don't in order to stifle competition and promote their own messaging features, whereas there would be more pressure to actually fix these things in the counterfactual, where people use multiple other messaging apps in the first place. But the third reason to note is that the creation of super apps arose from buying up smaller companies. Rarely do companies in-house create all the possible services that are attached to their super apps. It happens in a process where you buy out startups, where you buy out smaller companies, and you squash out all competition. There's much less incentive to do this outside. I'll take it after this mechanism. There's far less incentive to do this when you can't just attach new services and small services to a pre-existing successful service that you own. So you have to start over from scratch against competition, which is significantly harder and reduces that competition to just buy out all other services on our side of the house. The last mechanism that I'll briefly mention before taking the POI is that the mass agglomeration of political and financial capital in props world is just extremely harmful, where you have a significantly larger capacity for lobbying, where you have political influence as well. And perhaps you can, obviously companies can lobby on our side, but there's a significant difference when one company and one company's interests are now being represented with hundreds of billions of dollars they previously did not have. I'll take your POI.
Anti-monopoly laws still exist on our world. You need to understand that you need to just, explain how the status quo has looked like with this rise of all of these technologies, which hasn't looked like only one super app existing in the world.
So it's not one in the world, but it's when you have massive regions like China, where there's literally only one super app like WeChat, or when you look at the entirety of India, where the Tata app was basically monopolizing everything, that is kind of the reality you have to engage with. But this was actually perfect, because in the implications for this argument, I was just going to explain why proposition cannot just tell you that antitrust laws will exist with no explanation for why they will actually meaningfully be enforced or be effective, and expect that to mitigate our entire argument. First, implication. We think that when you form near monopolies, they're consequently extremely hard to regulate. So think about all the problems that exist in the status quo. This exacerbates problems with data protection and privacy. This exacerbates problems with exploitative behavior, with the creation of echo chambers and pushing extremist content. But also secondly, this means that when you have a larger capacity for lobbying, where one company's interests are being represented with hundreds of billions of dollars, you don't have the same capacity to create antitrust laws when politicians are being bought out. You don't have the same capacity to create antitrust laws where they're going to get repealed, and you have phenomenons like regulatory capture over time. But secondly, you have significantly worse competition in props world, and as a result, this means you have worse innovation, worse quality of services, worse choice, and by extension, worse convenience. So what does this actually look like? Because you can't just easily transfer between different services, this means you don't get things like cash transfers across different platforms. In the comparative, we think there's a far greater incentive to actually innovate when you have specialization. So think about Venmo, how your transfers there don't actually cost money, differentiating from other platforms like PayPal. And we think this allows for greater choice, where people can choose what works best for them. Contrary to what proposition is trying to sell you, oftentimes there isn't one app that will just universally best accommodate everyone, because as they identify, elderly people, younger people, people from different demographics often have different needs. So it is impossible for one app to actually accommodate for all of them. Whereas on our side, we think when you have far more versions of these services, that's when you truly have the choice to choose what's best for you. The second argument then is on privacy and data. Proposition supports a world where all of your data is basically consolidated in one app, where you live, for e-commerce, your credit card address, for cash transfers, your likes and dislikes from social media. No other individual company on our side can hold nearly so much information about you, your life, and your identity. Why then do we think privacy gets so much worse in proposition's world? Firstly, when data breaches inevitably happen, the damage becomes so much worse because companies access all of your information and your identity at once. And this does happen because cybersecurity is a big threat when it's inevitably profitable. When breaches do happen, even $2 billion social media companies, and they now literally know everything about you. But two, apps themselves, because they are free, like WeChat is free, a lot of these apps are free, they make money by selling your data. And the problem is most people don't read terms and conditions. They don't understand what cookies are. They don't understand tech concepts well enough to meaningfully consent, and they give away their data. And what is the actual harm about this? When social media companies, not just social media companies, but when super apps now start selling literally your postal code, when they start selling your financial information, this means it becomes far easier for other third parties to manipulate you. When they know everything about you, it's not just easier to drip feed you ads about products, it's easier to drip feed you political opinions on Facebook Marketplace, political opinions when you're using cash transfer apps. And in the comparative, this exists to a far, far lesser extent. Proposition's world is one that takes all the problems with social media, with large conglomerates, and magnifies them immensely by hundreds of billions of dollars, and we find that unacceptable.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever Deputy Prime Minister is ready, I'd like to invite them to continue this debate.
Cool. Sorry, just give me 2 minutes. I just need to switch my networks because I think that because my current one is quite weird.
Okay.
Cool, I'm back. I'm just confirming that I'm audible.
Yes, sure.
Please, can you just POI with the like raise hand function? I'll count myself in when I'm ready. And start in 3, 2, 1. Note that opposition's characterization is largely speculative about how this world of super apps could look like, but it doesn't actually function in the world of super apps' current existence, which this motion needs to defend. We think how super apps have rose has been largely within the global south. But these markets need to find innovative and novel ways in order to innovate their different markets to compete with how the super specialization of apps in the West has worked and has pretty much caused monopolies within certain sectors. We think that this has ultimately been a way to crack it out. I'm going to firstly just start with my one argument about how we combat Western technological hegemony, because I think it helps reframe this debate in a more genuine way to how the status quo has functioned. 2 things to note under combating Western hegemony. Firstly, it's empirically true that these apps have come from the global south. Literally all the Infoslide examples, things like Vodafone within Africa and Turkey, Alipay existing within China. Note that WeChat isn't the only super app in China, as things like Alipay also exist with massive competition against it. They can't just rely on all the information coming from the status quo. But secondly, the structural reason is that Western tech hegemonies have become very complacent in their hegemonies, and they've found it very beneficial just to stick to their one lane of their technology that they're in developing. So we think that they put less effort and resources into developing new strains. We have 3 impacts that we can derive from this. Firstly, on innovation, we think that the West does more in order to remain relevant in the globe. So what we think is actually likely is with Venmo is likely to try and super specialize even more so that it can compete against these apps. We think that even if they have, these networking benefits, if someone finds an app to be a lot cheaper for them personally and is able to be a lot more efficient with dealing with their companies, people are still likely to opt into this. They don't tell us why it is so catastrophic and is going to literally make people lose all common sense and start using apps that are not actually that helpful for them. But secondly, we told you that the Western tech has abused their hegemony. We think that it has data scandals with Cambridge Analytica within their specific branches. We think that they also have certain forms of monopolies. But when the other parts of the world are developing their own technology that is able to compete with these hegemonies because they offer a unique benefit of super accessibility and being super convenient because you can do all your things with one tap of a button, we think that they have to now compete with each other. They have greater accountability. And if they are so incredibly large as they say, we think that they're able to hold each other more accountable through things like competition, trying to call out each other more on the behaviors that they're doing and stuff like that. Thirdly, then, we think that in the status quo, it has still existed in forms of monopolies such as Meta and TikTok. The only way that we can combat this is by having these other operations that have been existing. They don't prove to us a way that we can actually combat the status quo's monopolization. We tell you that this rise has been combating this. Before I go into my 2 clashes, I'll take that POI.
So even with individual apps, for instance, Red Note in China, that's very much a specialized one service app. Why can't that exist on our side?
It can exist on your side, but we just tell you that it cannot compete with other apps as successfully. We also just gave you a bunch of arguments about user friendliness as well as just being a lot better app quality in general. Cool. Let's get on to the 2 clashes then. Firstly, let's deal with big data and whether it is actually harms people or not. They pretty much just tell us that they are able to know everything, so they're able to drip feed you. We actually combated this in our P1 for 2 reasons. We told you that you're able to track and monitor the sale of your data a lot more when it's in a centralized place, meaning that you're able to hold people accountable for things like class action lawsuits, where you know where the sale of your data originated from because you've only given it up to one person. Note this is me taking the hard line and me saying that they're absolute monopolies and you don't use any other apps. We actually say that this form of monopoly is something that's good. But B, we think that these apps don't need to sell your data as much and don't need to do as many pernicious things with your data in order to outcompete other people. So we think the main driving force between apps like drip feeding people political content is so that they can get into the pockets of governments so that they can outcompete these little apps. If these apps are so monopolistic and only 1 or 2 of them exist, they don't need to vie for political favor of one political party, and thus they're less likely to use your apps for pernicious things. But thirdly then, we think just in terms of accountability, we can concentrate political capital. We think the only time when people started to combat, hold Meta accountable is not when they were just their one Facebook where people would share pictures of each other, but when they started to take control of different forms of social media, because then they saw this as them having a monopoly over people's data. This is when people actually get mobilized to actually being able to hold people accountable on this. Cool. That is why we think that we are better for big data and holding them accountable. Secondly, then, they give second clash then about actually getting good, like pretty much just who is better for these apps. Firstly, they just tell us that you get uncontrolled conglomerates of control. Firstly, it's not how the world actually looks. We still have meta and things like monopolies on their worlds. Secondly, we told you that monopolies are fine as long as people want them and it's efficient. We think that the reason that people have wanted them is that it's often acquired through a process, quite an organic process. Even if it is through the acquiring of other apps, we still think that if people don't like these apps and on, the status quo apps like Venmo and PayPal still exist, if people decide to use something like Alipay or WeChat to pay for things, it often means it's because it's the most efficient thing for them. So we still think that people are opting in to efficiency just based on a mechanism of common sense. Thirdly, we then think that competition has become toxic, has been undercutting as all the things that I told you in the first clash. Secondly, then, we think that on lobbying, I've already told you why you have greater incentives, I've responded to this. Thirdly, then, in just terms of versions of your service. One, we think that if super apps function how they do, Venmo now has to become super specialized and something that is in order to actually find its new way in the market. So we think that if apps are unable to compete by becoming super apps and offering a different variety of features, they're likely to now double down because they have greater competition in this world in order to make the apps a lot more efficient. Let me now just weigh our argumentation that went largely unresponded to. We told you that we are able to actually improve the quality of these apps. Two ways that we do this. Firstly, in terms of access, they didn't understand our argument about you only having to learn one user interface. Because you only have to learn about how one app functions, what one button means, what one symbol correlates with things, it means that it's very easy for you to learn more things. Because something like banking can be incredibly hard for you to understand. But if you understand the basic features of one messaging app and all the things in the banking app look relatively similar, it's easier for people to access this. This has a very big impact because we're able to get people who've been locked out of technology because of income or just because of their age into the technological space. They are also then able to do things like be able to become more tech literate and get technology for all. Secondly, then on innovation, notably, we gave you structural reasons for innovation, not just saying a bunch of little companies actually get more innovation. Three ways we do this. One, cross-pollination of tech sectors. Because we're operating with different forms of technology within the same company, you incentivize to try and move these different things. So now with TikTok, with this rise, is now also trying to make its app more of a super app by developing things like marketplace, meaning it can use this algorithm technology to do things like implement it into how to sell things, and you can use your different engineers that have their subspecialties and share it a lot more. They need to prove why different apps on their world that are inherently trying to compete with each other for market share are going to be willing to share this information in order for them to claim this benefit of cross-pollination. Secondly, then, we just told you, we just get more technology because the app doesn't just develop in their certain niche, but they develop a variety of options. So we think more apps are trying to break into more different technological spaces. So we actually end up with more people getting more control because not just WeChat, it's things like Vodafone existing, it's things like Alipay existing. We think it's often a variety of it. But just in terms of convenience panel, I think their logical extension of the argument is quite weird because instead of just having Google, Safari, and Yahoo, they'd want to break them all down into even smaller companies. One app that simply all you can do is Google something about pretty dresses and another app about Googling math and science and stuff like this. We think that this is often, even if it may lead to greater innovation, we think that it's just highly inconvenient for people to use. We think that when we can be able to get it all together, it's very convenient for people. Lastly, then, we told you economies of scale. We're able to make things cheaper. Banking fees become cheaper when we have greater economies of scale. Yes, Venmo might do it because of competition, but we think that more apps can do it on a larger scale with economies of scale. That is a very clear prop ballot.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever Deputy Leader of Opposition is ready, I would like to invite them to continue this debate.
Cool. Just to confirm, I'm still audible.
Yes, you are.
Thanks. I'll take verbal POI, so just unmute and say POI. A core observation I want to make of the proposition case is that regardless of how much strategic stuff they throw around about the status quo and what it is and how comparatives work, there's a fundamental weakness and vagueness in their mechanization and impacts. They just sort of throw around the term economies of scale and they never tell you what this actually means. What do we mean by cross-pollination? What technology is helping what other technology? And then in the end, we get an impact about search bars, which clearly are going to be implemented in any world. We get impacts about, well, you're going to make the UI more simplistic, realistic, which every app always has an incentive to do regardless. We said that the case rigor of their side was never sufficient, even if you bought into all of the strategic stuff that Second tries to do. But given that, I want to do four things in this speech. Firstly, I want to address sort of the status quo push and what this motion means that Second Prop throws out to you. Secondly, I want to talk about services for consumers. Thirdly, about political protections. And finally, about privacy. Firstly, then, Second Prop says this thing about we need to engage with how the status quo already is and then assert some things about Alipay in China. But here's the thing. This is a this house supports motion. So obviously we can still care about how this continues into the future. If the rise of super apps continues into the future and it's harmful or good for whatever reason, I think that is perfectly legitimate ground for whether or not we should support this motion. So this weird motion quibble that we get from Second Prop is just not going to work. We think that our structural reasons for why the rise of super apps necessarily created less competition, necessarily created less political protections, and necessarily created less privacy protections could still stand in this debate. So don't buy into this, motion quibble that they throw out in Second. First question then on services for consumers. What we told you was very simple. It was that the rise of super apps always means that there is a undermining of competition in the sector. And this isn't just about monopolies, because this argument doesn't only function if you literally have a single company in an entire nation, right? We told you that there are a variety of reasons in which huge apps that span multiple different services undermine the ability of other companies to come in and disrupt the industry, that they enhance network effects, that now everyone has overlapping networks within this one app, and this gets crucially applied to new services that wouldn't have been on the other side. So on our side, maybe it's very reasonable that you'd have sort of like payment services like e-transfer in Canada, for instance, that aren't really that are universal, that don't involve sort of network effects, and you can just use it and it doesn't depend on how many other people are using it. But on their side, once WeChat becomes the major player in sort of paying other people and becomes a Venmo equivalent, suddenly there's a huge incentive for WeChat to use that to promote their own network, to make their network effect of their social media platforms and all of the other things that WeChat does even stronger, to perhaps even have deals with banks and have specific preferential treatments for certain cards that you hook up to WeChat Pay. So we said that these network effects uniquely made competition harder and made it even more difficult and created a wider moat for new applications to rise up and maybe disrupt or challenge the industry or offer legitimate alternatives to people. When there's a huge agglomeration of people into these apps at a large enough volume that they could even become super apps in the first place, that necessarily undermines competition. But even further, we said that the supposed cross-pollination they want to talk about is actually bad in many ways. That when WeChat has like red envelopes as a way of sending money to other people, they incessantly integrate that into their messaging apps. So like every 20 minutes, you're being told you got to send like 10 yuan to your friend or whatever to do other things. And so this kind of advertisement and this sort of supposed cross-pollination was not stuff that just broadly created great tech that benefited humanity. It specifically improved the financial incentives and the bottom line of these companies in ways that we said hurt competition. And finally, Sarah told you that they buy up smaller companies, and this was a necessity for them to become so large in the first place. It's really speculative to spend all this R&D on new services that we don't know about. The way that super apps arise is they buy new technologies as they become viable, ones that could have become their own companies in the first place. So the implication of all of this is that even if they can suggest there's some competition, maybe in some cases between these massive oligarchic companies, there's always more competition on our side. And that competition was always going to create better services for consumers. When there's less friction to switch between different applications, there's more of an incentive for companies to improve their apps, to maybe put in the search bars, the UI that they want to talk about so much. So clearly there is a margin on competition on our side, and that already wins us the debate. But they talk about, wow, there are economies of scale that increase access. The first question I have is, what do we even mean by economies of scale here? Like, economies of scale refers to when you can get enough people somewhere that you overcome the fixed costs, like of manufacturing, for instance, or maybe of hiring certain numbers of people. But I don't understand how this applies to social media applications, right? They just don't give us a very clear picture of this. But even if there was an economy of scale, we told you that this was coercive. This something that enabled these companies to undermine people's ability to make legitimate choices in a market, undermine the free market, and made these services worse. So given that their entire case has been about services, I think this should already win opposition to debate. But even further, we told you about how political protections are uniquely eroded by the rise of super apps, that super apps represent a unique agglomeration of power that does not happen on our side of the house. These companies have more financial capital, more cultural relevance, more importance to democratic parties as a way to disseminate information than anything that could exist on our side, because they're so pervasive in culture for them to be super apps in the first place. We said that this made them uniquely hard to even have antitrust regulations in the first place. These are the largest companies that can afford way more lobbying, that people are afraid to regulate in the first place because they're so huge and they affect so many parts of society. They supposedly want to just throw antitrust in the wall and hope that fixes the problem. But these political protections are uniquely eroded on their side. It makes it easier for these companies to harm democracy in ways that are really, really bad. They say, well, no, people will get motivated more. I don't understand what this means, right? I think the harm already happens if people get motivated. And this outrage isn't enough to turn around the corporation's bottom lines. The larger and larger the companies get on their side that they supposedly say is convenient means that these political protections get harder and harder to apply. It gets harder and harder to regulate these companies in good ways. And the implication of that is that even if you did care about convenience, and even if you thought that it was more convenient that WeChat could extort you for every piece of your data, that didn't matter because it meant that your own regulations became more and more challenging to apply. It means that companies like Facebook can go into places like Myanmar and have almost complete monopolies over the government and lobby the government and capture the government and institutions in ways that are really bad. But finally, we told you about privacy, which is our third path to victory here, that there is a unique centralization of user data now, that even during the pandemic, things like COVID test passports were held on WeChat as well. We said that the implication of all of this data being centralized was that it's more harmful whenever data breaches do occur, that it's easier for bad actors to exploit this kind of data because it's all centralized so easily in ways that can be sold far more easily. And even without these explicit leaks that are uniquely far more damaging on their side of the house, we said that this new information about every facet of your life that these companies had gave them the ability to coercively put political influence on you, to sell you things in ways that we thought was deeply, deeply problematic. For all these reasons, we are incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever government is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude that part of this debate for the side government.
Cool. I don't know. I'm feeling sociable with my camera on. Just give me a second. Great. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Canada's having this debate 10 years too late because we never had to defend the existence of WeChat being a weird singular monopoly. We had to defend the rise of super apps, the recent rise, like continual developments in India and Singapore and in America. This means that this is not a discussion about monopolistic behavior. The harms that they describe are the ones they precisely have to defend on their case, because this was never a debate about the existence of WeChat being bad. This was a debate about evaluating the increasing rise of super apps, such that there are a large number of super apps. Think about the trend of Elon Musk wanting to form Twitter into a super app, as opposed to just WeChat and singular monopolies existing. This means they had to engage with the context that we create an opening in a historically stagnant market that allows individuals to engage with far more opportunities when we revitalize competition. 3 things I'm going to do in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to reframe the context of this debate because they've been having it in a context where there's a singular super app, and that's just broadly untrue. Secondly, I'm going to speak to access, which seems to have become the largest issue in this debate. I'll speak about big data and like the West in a second. Firstly, let's speak about the use of apps, because this is an evaluation of the use of apps now. So our side probably looks like individuals using some super apps that are part of a large super app oligopoly. Think about the Infoslide illustrating discussions about super apps from Singapore and from India. And not only are these apps in certain, like one app per region, think about the fact that the USA has 4 rising super apps in like the formation of Meta, X, and like the way Google is trying to develop itself, as well as Microsoft's incentives. Further than this, though, individuals can still use individual apps when they find that more useful. Daniel told you about the fact that when a market opportunity is created where super apps become a thing, smaller apps don't get bought up and instead they choose to specialize in different areas. Comparatively, what did they have to defend? One, they had to defend individual apps existing under large parent companies. Think about Instagram existing in the USA. Or if they were talking about super apps, they had to defend super apps that were massively monopolistic, i.e. WeChat in China. They've done a very good job of describing the harms there, so I don't think I need to spend a lot more time on it. At the best case then, that means they have to engage with some kind of monopolies on their side. Notably, even if on both sides monopolies exist, our monopolies will always be better because individuals consent far more to our monopolies. Think about the fact that A, this rise was driven by market forces in individuals being more interested in convenience, and B, this rise was driven by necessity, i.e. people being sick of like switching between apps. This is important because monopolies that people consent to are fine. Think about Norway's healthcare system being a monopoly. We're still okay with it because individuals consented to it. So there's no clear harm to just monopolies in their existence. That context was important because it illustrated that the harms they describe are the ones that they actually have to defend. And this debate happens in an instance where we have oligopolies and not necessarily monopolies. That means competition isn't likely to exist as they describe. First clash on access. This is important because they have to defend on the comparative a discussion without the rise, i.e. Zuckerberg and Elon Musk beefing over like what app is likely to be most relevant. This is also just stagnant and means competition devolves into less valuable things. One argument that we gave you under this clash on accessibility, this wasn't just an assertion of economies of scale. We expressly told you that when large businesses are formed, because of niches in the market, individuals are able to like hire different individuals for various departments. This means that various departments can share info between each other and do things like create more advanced versions of apps without having to meld apps together, instead creating new businesses, i.e. having someone who is an AI engineer being able to work in like one company, but do effectively more jobs and like have more impact because he's working on one app. That was important because it illustrated that even if monopolies are something we have to defend, we get cheaper apps and individuals on the ground care far more about that. Two things in terms of responses to what they gave you on competition. Firstly, they don't engage with the opening that exists in the market, i.e. they have to defend stagnation on our side. Comparatively, the rise has been so rapid that an opening has occurred in the market and individuals are rushing to chase that competition. A few things that this looks like characterization-wise that implicitly responds to them. Firstly, buyout, like buying out small companies, is far less likely to exist because the rise of super apps has meant big companies instead invest into creating their own larger and larger apps as opposed to buying out new companies, i.e. WhatsApp is investing in adding AI instead of buying smaller companies. Even if they do buy smaller companies, that's just a manifestation of economies of scale further, and we're fine with that. This is true for two reasons. A, we don't have a first mover advantage on our side because this rise has been so rapid, i.e. there's no advantage to existing entrenched in power as Zuckerberg and other individuals in monopolies exist on their side. Further than this, Daniel told you that unique specialization of individual apps is something that exists because individuals choose what apps are beneficial to them based on smaller apps having to like change and differentiate themselves from big apps insofar as they're like now going to exist as specialized, i.e. Uber would change the way its app works to make sure it can differentiate itself from like the oligopoly, like WeChat's version of like car services and that kind of thing. This is important because the networking effect then only applies when individuals wanted to, i.e. having a shared platform for social engagement such as TikTok. But individuals are able to use less apps and like but still benefit from the nuance of more varied apps, such as a specialized Uber app. Comparatively, they have to defend more monopolies. This is just garbage. Two reasons why. One, these have been entrenched in markets for a long time and have massive presence. This means that they are not necessarily disrupted by other market forces and do more of the buying up of small companies that exists on their side. Secondly, though, these things have attachment to politics. Look to, based on the fact that their only differentiating factor is now attaching themselves to something like politics. Look to Elon Musk and X censoring individuals. This means that the kind of competition that exists on their side is one that is expressly harmful because it is one that undercuts individuals. At worst, we just have competition that is slightly more monopolistic, but we've already told you that people consent to this. They have to defend undercut competition and competition that is more like more unethical in things like political manipulation. We win more in this clash beyond the fact that we're ahead on context. One, because we get cheaper and more accessible apps to individuals on the ground, which they care about more. Secondly, we're probably more ethical insofar as the kinds of monopolies that exist are ones that individuals have consented to through this rise. Thirdly, we protect vulnerable actors of people who have historically not accessed technology. Important because we're ahead on their metric of individuals being protected in terms of their access to technology. Before I speak about big data, sure.
So your impact on these things being cheaper is kind of ridiculous because PayPal, Venmo, WeChat, before becoming a super app, Instagram, these things have always been free.
Yes, that may be true, but in-app services are costly, i.e. PayPal charges you transaction costs. We reduce that. That's our impact on being cheaper. Secondly, let's speak to accountability and like big data. We gave you two things under this. Firstly, we told you that individuals have more time to do things like read the consent terms of an app, given that they are using less apps on our side. So they probably spend more time investing into that engagement with that data. But secondly, because no one engages with this, individuals will always give up their data on both sides of the debate, because inherent to having free apps is individuals giving up their data. On our side, we just give individuals more information of how they give up their data, insofar as we have them reading the terms of conditions more deeply, because they have one app that they're likely to invest in for a longer amount of time and therefore perceive a value in reading the terms and conditions. Secondly, though, we probably better protect against things like cybersecurity, given that we are more easily able to concentrate data and therefore protect it with things like the Great Chinese Firewall and like large data projects being able to protect individuals. That means we concentrate protection as well as concentrating data, so we're better for cybersecurity. Even if cybersecurity issues happen, we have individuals who have more so consented to their data being out in society. We weigh more, one, because we probably get more accessible legislative change long-term with singular super apps existing, and two, we're probably ahead, given that we embolden individuals to access opportunities that are genuinely valuable to them. Canada had this debate 10 years ago. It's a clear problem.
Thank you for that fine speech. And whenever opposition group is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude constructive part of this debate.
Okay, cool. All right. Sorry. Okay, awesome. Sorry about that. I take my POIs verbally, so feel free to just unmute and say POI. That's completely fine. All right. I'll get started in 3, 2, 1. I feel like the entire proposition case can just be gut checked, right? They say because there's only one app, you're going to read the 45-page long terms and conditions. Really? Is that really what's going to happen, right? And given the vast host of examples they've given, such as Facebook or like WeChat, where nobody reads the terms and conditions, despite there only being one app, I feel like a lot of their case is just very unfeasible, where it would be nice to believe those things, but those things aren't what really happens, and we think for those reasons they lose the round. Firstly, I want to explain how the rise of these super apps happened. I think that's going to frame out the majority of their case. Second, I'm going to talk about political coercion and risks. Thirdly, on competition. Firstly, then, let's talk about how the rise of these super apps came to be. In order for super apps to exist, you need a large amount of money and existing market share. So these are not just tiny little dinky apps that, organically rose to power by somehow having the best simple UI around all 95 surfaces. Clearly, you already needed a significant portion of power in order to get to the point that you already are. So structurally, you're already a pretty powerful actor. But on top of that, we would argue that you gain infinitely more power with every additional company that you acquire or every additional new skill that you have, because it means that people are less and less likely going to be able to leave your app, because if they delete your app, all those services go away. This is like how WeChat started off as a messaging platform and additionally added on other apps. It's like how Grab started off as a rideshare platform and ended up also adding a messaging portion to this. The implication of this is very, very simple, that you gain infinitesimally more monopoly power under their side of the house when these already large companies, right, decide to be super apps. The second thing I want to talk about, and this is just a brief throwaway, but like, TikTok or like Twitter or like Facebook, they're not buying rideshare apps, and none of them are incorporating things such as like, like economic, like banking platforms onto there. We're probably talking about apps such as WeChat, right? So don't let them like get away with saying, well, you still have alternatives in the US. This debate is likely mostly focused on things like WeChat or Grab, as the Infoslide correctly points out. It's weird that in their third speech, they were like, oh, opposition needs to defend WeChat. No, you need to defend WeChat. That's literally what the motion says. Okay, then, first thing, let's talk about political coercion and risks. What did we say? We said that there was an overwhelming political agglomeration that existed, that these companies now were multi-billion-dollar companies because they're super apps, right? They have the ability to have all of these different sectors, all of the lawyers from all these sectors centralized to lobby and control the government. What did we hear from this? We heard one weak response, which was literally like, well, because you consented into the super app, weirdly enough, that meant that they can sell all of your data and go wherever you want, right? Clearly, that's not the case. But more importantly, you do not consent to the political harms that come as a result of the overwhelming hegemony that exists by these large companies, right? You have no idea what their lobbyists do behind closed doors. You have no idea. We think that's in and of itself problematic. But the second thing is, look, our claim was not that your data would not be sold under our side of the house, but that different apps only got small sandwich bites of your type of data. So perhaps your rideshare app knows where you live. Perhaps your social media app knows what your favorite color is. But these types of data cannot conglomerate into literally your identity on the internet. And that company is being able to sell that out is particularly problematic, right? That agglomeration of data was problematic. We heard literally no response to this. What are the political harms of this, right? Companies can easily influence the beliefs of the common population, right? And in a way that is not consensual. You do not consent to the types of ads that you see on WeChat, right? And, under our side of the house, you may still be able to switch because you have different types of apps that exist. You have TikTok, you have Instagram Reels. But in a place such as WeChat, where there's only one or two options, we would argue that switch is fundamentally not possible. And this political harm manifests itself in very real ways, right? In ways in which perhaps, for instance, Facebook, which is perhaps, as they say, on the rise of being a super app, was able to coerce and change information that ultimately interfered in the US election via Cambridge Analytica. So clearly there are massive political harms. What is the implication of this? Even if we don't care about this competition business at all, we think that the smaller apps are just going to be absolute garbage and they're going to be so hard to use because you can't plug in the search bar. At least we have the security of the common population. If their winning claim that they say in their first speech is about humanity and it's about saving humanity and making sure that this is the next step, we think the most important step is to keep populations safe. We think they are unable structurally to do that under their side house.
Why?
Now then, no thank you. Let's talk about competition because they want to talk about competition. Their main claim is, well, you can innovate and you can do these things and whatever, right? But this is always a likelihood. So is it likely that that's what's going to happen? And the reality of the situation is that it is unlikely, that WeChat has not had a meaningfully new development in years that has actually improved the user experience, right? That WeChat just keeps on making us send these stupid red envelopes because they're trying to make money off of us. The reality is, if you are a monopoly, you have no incentives to innovate. And we said super apps make that monopoly so much more powerful because it is a pervasive force in every single portion of your life.
Point.
How you drive to work, where you get educated, what apps you're reading, who you're messaging, what books you're understanding, those things all upon in which influence your life, we would argue that means they have very, very little incentive to innovate. And they just counter assert. They say, no, these large super apps don't buy other companies. Why, right? They just say it happens organically. It's impossible for you to organically have 6 different functions on an app that are all unique from each other that you all just managed to create all by yourself. But the important part of this argument was simple. That sure, it may not be a monopoly, right? But it is a monopoly geographically in the area that it is. That WeChat participates in things like tacit collusion with Grab, where they mutually agree not to intervene in each other's super app realms so they don't cut into each other's bottom lines. You get way less accountability when they are in fact super apps because they know if they encroach on the other super apps territory that actually will cut into their bottom line. And the most important part of this competition, You don't even get companies
Point.
starting in these areas, right? You have no apps to super specialize, because why the hell would you start a payment app if you know that WeChat is either going to buy you out or quash you because they're a multi-billion-dollar company? You don't even get the very innovation that they themselves require as a result of Superapps in the first place. We would argue that is incredible. That the conclusion of this is very simple, which is that the crushing weight of reality doesn't seem to fully strike them yet. That it is true that WeChat
Before
is
time.
the only option when it comes to messaging apps, when it comes to payment apps in China. That there is no Uber, no Didi in Singapore, because Grab is the only app available for you to use. They do not understand the overwhelming power that these apps have on the common life of citizens. We think for those reasons, they automatically lose around. But we give you multiple other reasons as to why competition gets way worse, right? That there's a networking effect. So not only are you forced to use the payment service that WeChat makes you use, but you also have to use their messaging service. And as a result, they're like friend sharing service as a whole that is incredibly invasive. Because if you get rid of the app because ethically you don't want your data going to WeChat, you will not survive in a country like China. Companies such as WeChat and Grab are indicative of what the rise of super apps will look like in the future. We don't like this future. That's why we do not support the rise of these super apps. I don't understand why this was so incredibly difficult for them to understand. We told you that it was exploitative, and their argument by minorities doesn't make any sense, by the way, because they can still use a vast majority of these apps. But I think the conclusion as to why we win this round is very simple. Even if you do not believe any of our competition arguments whatsoever, the fact that their only argument against data privacy is that maybe the Chinese government will help, we think they definitely lose around those reasons. So proud to oppose things.
Thank you for that fine speech, and whenever opposition reply is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude the opposition's part in this debate.
Cool. I'll discuss 3 questions in this reply. Firstly, on the services and convenience for consumers. Secondly, on political protections. And thirdly, on privacy. Firstly, on convenience and better services, which you've heard a lot of engagement on in this debate. I think there were broadly 2 ways in which both sides tried to reach this outcome. The first was competition that you heard a lot about. But what I'll note from the top here is that there was never any response to our very structural mechs about how the network effects of social media companies that already make them quite anti-competitive get way more amplified on their side. With the rise of super apps, they become more anti-competitive. They buy up more small companies, and that is very, very bad. They just said, well, these super apps arose organically, but organically doesn't mean it's not a monopoly. Organically doesn't mean it's good. Organically was how Standard Oil arose. That was really, really bad. Monopolies arise all the time from organic market conditions where there's something that they can exploit, where they have network effects that are not regulated, where they have the ability to buy up smaller companies. So the weighing here was that if you believe that competition was what created cost and convenience for all of consumers, then clearly we always have more competition on our side. We can take them on their best ground and suggest that, oh, maybe there are 2 or 3 options anyways, but there's always more competition on opposition. Instead of actually responding to these sorts of mechs, then, they sort of give up in third prop and just have this framing push about whether it's 10 years or what this motion means or what we're discussing the status quo. I think you should just take a very easy, simple approach to this motion, right? Do we support the rise of super apps? And we gave you a variety of reasons for why the rise of super apps in any context always means that they were buying up smaller companies, always means that their network effects were stronger and there was less competition. So we already win on this competition point. But even if you think that they can win with their framing push on competition, we give you a second reason for why more convenience exists on our side from my second speech and carried into Jade's speech that was never responded to, that the incentive of these companies aren't to create pro-consumer changes, that even if they had cross-subsidization of tech and economies of scale, they use this knowledge to further coerce people. It was WeChat incessantly putting this red envelope feature gimmick into all of its messaging services because it wanted you to use its banking service more. These things didn't help consumers, but they were something that the increased access of data allowed these companies to do to increase their bottom line. So even if we thought there was more competition, the incentive of these companies that agglomerate and are larger and have more data and more power isn't to be pro-consumer. So these services were always going to be better on opposition, and that should already give us the win. But even further, we told you about political protection, that even if you thought there was marginally more convenience on prop, there is far more agglomeration of lobbying power, of cultural capital, of the control of data and narratives, and this ability to determine what society thinks that exists with these massive social media apps that just know way more about you because they have access to far more data. We said that this was bad for these democracies across the world, and this clearly outweighed small conveniences in every way. Sure, maybe it's easier for me to navigate the new UI, but if that comes at the cost of unaccountable lobbying corporations that undermine and capture my government, that's clearly bad. They wanted to say that, well, there's more accountability, but similar to most of their case, this was never really meched out. Like, okay, I really care about holding this corporation accountable, and I know precisely which corporation exists because they own everything. What am I supposed to do about that as an individual person? The lobbying pressure and the inside knowledge of these corporations was always going to outweigh that incentive on our side. And finally, about privacy, that goes hopelessly unresponded to on their side with unintuitive claims about user agreements. We said that the leaking of people's bank accounts, of people's locations, that was incredibly harmful and way worse and way more catastrophic on their side. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. And when our government's reply speaker is ready, I would like to invite them to conclude both this debate and in rounds of this tournament.
Cool. Just confirming that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Awesome. I'll count myself in when I'm ready. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Canada didn't tell us at all why they have a problem with this rise. They told us why they have a problem with the existence of big tech, which exists in their world of Meta and stuff. They also told us why they just have an existence with the very existence of super apps in of itself. But this debate is not about whether super apps should exist or not. It's saying, based on the fact that they do exist, like WeChat, should we try and is the rise of more apps trying to become super apps something that has benefited society, or is something that has held these apps more or not to account? Okay, let's just deal with their biggest clash about political protections. This is literally the only thing they spend their time on. They tell us, one, that it's harder to place laws on them and data breaches are worse. All of my responses are going to be pretty much just in the worst case that they try and push us in, where it's only one super app that exists. Firstly, we told you that you had centralized it, so you created to have political pressure. It's easier to track. We told you the biggest problem with previous data breaches is that you're unable to tell where these data breaches came from and who is the person that is committing these crimes against you. Secondly, we told you that there's less need to actually do bad things with your data because of politicians. Let's just say that you only have one bad app. Why do you need to do things like side with certain political groups? Why do you need to lobby? Why do you need to promote a political agenda? We told you that you don't. You can simply just focus on efficiency, because this is what's going to lead to people continuing to support your app and not want to support other apps, as opposed to other places where you have lots of different apps that need political support in order for governments to give laws to them that's going to help them. Thirdly, we told you that you know where these data breaches are. You can hold them more accountable in lawsuits and stuff like that. But fourthly, we told you that the agglomeration of data is pretty much just symmetric, because they don't recognize that in their world, and which is pretty much post this, is you still just have gigantic parent companies. You still have PayPal that owns things like Venmo and owns a bunch of other payment apps. You have Meta that owns pretty much every single social media platform. This is what exists on their world. So even if you buy all these things, we tell you that the worst case these harms about agglomeration of data is something that's symmetric. But let's just deal with this in the actual case. One, this debate is not just about China, and it's just about, China pretty much not allowing any other app except WeChat to exist. Secondly, we told you that Tata Neu and Vodafone Vodafone has also started to grow in South India. So it can't just be like Tata Neu, but when we actually have more the rise of super apps, we see more super apps trying to compete for dominance within different markets. We simply put them against each other. We get greater political protections because they're holding each other more accountable. But even if you don't buy that, just note that their world is not one with no super super apps that have a monopoly. We told you why oligopolies is something that is better than monopolies, which is something that, yes, it may be marginal, but it's still pretty intuitive. But note, they didn't respond to my argument I gave you in P2, which is a unique extension of apps being able to challenge Western tech monopolies. Because he told you that the West has had a monopoly over tech and has been able to go unchallenged. We told you that super apps have provided a way for developing nations to actually get access into these different markets. Something else that I think you just need to note contextually, panel, is that all, like the vast majority of countries that don't just have evil totalitarian governments have access to the same Play Store, have access to the same, Google, App Store. So they can download Uber, but they choose not to download Uber because it has been something that isn't good for them. We think that if these apps, if Uber is something that is so important, these gigantic super apps would have just bought it, but people don't care about Uber because they can tailor it to their specific communities. That is why these monopolies or just very large companies have existed within areas. Let's just deal now with the quality of these apps, which we clearly want. Firstly, we told you about options. Note the characterization that I just gave you also proves why people often use these apps just based on the fact that it provides them a better option. Secondly, on access, we proved to you why it's easier to access these apps. We told you you have the same user interface between your banking app, your WhatsApp, which just means that less tech literate people can actually access it. Secondly, the economies of scale, they literally just gave us the most lazy analysis ever about what is an economy of scale. It's pretty obvious is that you just use the same engineers to make new features. So you can charge a cheaper service fee. You can charge cheaper things for ride share and transfer fees. Overall, we just think that we can make things cheaper. So even if, they have these slight political protections, which is an incredibly marginal difference, at least people can deal with their corrupt governments that aren't going away and the evil lobbying powers with a little bit more money in their bank. We think that this may be a marginal benefit, but anyways, it's a clear prop ballot.
Thank you for that fine speech, and thank you all for this wonderful debate.